Recording by Betty B. Love Romances of the Aristocracy by Thornton Hall. Chapter 8. The Gorgeous Countess. If, a century ago, Edmund Power of Knockbrit in County Tipperary had been told that his second daughter, Marguerite, would one day blossom into a countess and live in history as one of the most gorgeous figures in the fashionable world of London under three kings, he would certainly have considered his prophetic informant an escaped lunatic, and would probably have told him so with the brutal frankness which was one of his most amiable characteristics. The Irish squire was a proud man, proud of his pretty and shiftless wife, with her eternal talk of her Desmond ancestors, proud of two of his three daughters, whose budding beauty was to win for them titled husbands, one an English viscount, the other a Comte de Saint-Marcent, and proudest of all of his own handsome figure and his local dignities. But he was frankly ashamed to own himself father of his second daughter, Marguerite, the ugly duckling of a good-looking family, and with no gifts or promise to qualify her plainness. But the squireen was probably too full of his own self-importance to waste much thought or regret on an insignificant, unattractive girl, though she was his own child. He loved to strut about among his humble neighbors in all the unprovincial glory of ruffles and lace, buckskins and top boots, and snowy, wide-spreading cravat. He was the king of Tipperary dandies, known far beyond his own county as Buck Power and Shiver the Frills, and what pleased his vanity still more, he was a justice of the peace, with authority to scour the country at the head of a company of dragoons, tracking down rebels and spreading terror wherever he went. That he was laughed at for his coxcombry and hated for his petty tyranny only seemed to add to the zest of his enjoyment of life, and he saw, at least, a knighthood as the prospective recognition of his importance, and his services to the king and the peace. Such was the father and such the home of Marguerite Power, who was one day to dazzle the world as the most gorgeous Lady Blessington. As with many another ugly duckling, Marguerite Power's beauty was only dormant in these days of childhood, and before she had graduated into long frocks, the bud was opening which was to grow to so beautiful a flower. If her father was blind to the change, it was patent enough to other eyes, and she had scarcely passed her 14th birthday when she had at least two lovers eager to pay homage to her girlish charm. Captains Murray and Farmer, brother officers of a regiment stationed at Clonmel. To the wooing of Captain Murray, young, handsome, and desperately in earnest, she lent a willing ear. But when thus encouraged, he asked her to be his wife. She blushingly declined the offer on the ground that she was yet much too young to think of a wedding ring. To the rival captain, old enough to be her father, a man moreover whose evil living and satanic temper were notorious, she showed the utmost aversion. "I hate him," she protested in tears to her father, who supported his suit, "and I would rather die 100 times than marry him." But Beau Power was the last man to be moved from his purpose by a child's tears or pleadings. Captain Farmer was a man of wealth and good family, and also one of his own boon companions, and thus, tearful, indignant, protesting to the last, the girl was led to the altar by the biggest scoundrel in Tipperary, a maiden tribute to a lover's lust and a father's ambition. The child's fears were more than realized in the wedded life that followed. Before the honeymoon had waned, the captain began to treat his young wife with all the brutality of which he was such a past master. Blows and oaths were her daily lot, and when his cruelty wrung tears from her, her husband would lock her in her room and leave her for days, without fire or food, until she condescended to beg for mercy. After 3 months of this inferno, the captain was ordered to a distant station, and as his wife refused point-blank to accompany him, was by no means reluctant to be rid of the brat by sending her back to her home. Here, however, the child wife found herself less welcome than, and almost as unhappy as in her wedded life, and driven to despair, she left the home in which she had been cradled and fared forth alone into the world, which could not be more unkind than those whose duty it was to shield and care for her. How or where Beaupower's daughter lived during the next 12 years must always remain largely a mystery. At one time she appears in Dublin, at another in Cahir, but mostly she seems to have spent her time in England. Over this part of her adventurous life a curtain is drawn. Though some have endeavored to raise it, and have professed to discover scandalous doings for which there seems to be no vestige of authority. We know that by the time she was 20, Sir Thomas Lawrence was so struck by her beauty that he immortalized it on canvas, but it is only in 1816 that the curtain is actually raised, and we find her living with her brother in London, where, to quote her sister, she received at her house only those whose age and character rendered them safe friends, and a very few others, on whose perfect respect and consideration she could wholly rely. Among the latter was the Earl of Blessington, then a widower. Whatever may have been her life during this obscure period, when her charms were maturing into such exquisite beauty, it is thus certain that at its close she was moving in a good circle, and was as irreproachable as she was lovely. Of her rascally husband she had happily seen nothing during all those years of more or less lonely adventure, and the end of this tragic union was now near. One day in October 1817 the captain ended his misspent days in tragedy. He had drifted through dissipation and crime to the King's Bench prison, and in a fit of frenzy, or as some say, in a drunken quarrel, had flung himself to death through a window of his jail. Thus at last the nightmare that had clouded the young life of the squire's daughter was over, and she was free to plan her future as she would. What this future was to be was soon placed beyond doubt. The widowed Earl of Blessington had long been among the most ardent admirers of the lovely Irishwoman, and before Farmer had been many months in his prison grave he had won her consent to be his countess. The ugly duckling had reached a coronet through such trials and vicissitudes as happily seldom fall to the lot of woman, and her future was to be as radiant as her past had been ignoble and obscure. Seldom has a woman cradled in comparative poverty made such a splendid alliance. Lord Blessington was a veritable Croesus among Irish landlords, with a rent roll of £30,000 a year, allied, it is true, to an extravagance more than commensurate with his revenue. He had a passion for all things theatrical, and an almost barbaric taste in the gorgeous furnishings with which he loved to surround himself, and this taste his wife seems to have shared. When the Earl took his bride to his ancestral home, Mountjoy Forest, she revelled in her boudoir, with its hangings of crimson Genoa silk velvet, trimmed with gold bullion fringe, and all the furniture of equal richness. But she had had enough of Irish life in the days of her childhood, and soon sighed to return to London, and to a wider sphere for her beauty and her social ambition, and before she had been a bride of 6 months, we find her installed in St. James Square, drawing to her salon all the greatest and most famous in the land, and moving among her courtiers with the dignity and graciousness of a queen. Royal dukes kissed her hand, statesmen basked in her smile, Moore sang his sweetest songs for her delight, and all the arts and sciences worshipped at her shrine, and raved about her beauty of face and graces of mind. Sated at last with all this splendor and adulation, my Lady Blessington yearned for more worlds to conquer, and so, one August day in 1822, she and her lord set out on a triumphal progress through Europe, with a retinue of attendants, and with luxurious equipages such as a king might have been proud to boast. In France they added to their train Count d'Orsay, who threw up his army commission under the lure of the Countess's beautiful eyes, and seldom has fair lady had so devoted and charming a cavalier as this admirable Crichton of Georgian days. Count d'Orsay, says Charles James Matthews, the famous comedian, who knew him well, was the beau ideal of manly dignity and grace. He was the model of all that could be conceived of noble demeanor and youthful candor. Handsome beyond all question, accomplished to the last degree, highly educated, and of great literary acquirements, with a gaiety of heart and cheerfulness of mind that spread happiness on all around him. His conversation was brilliant and engaging, as well as instructive. He was, moreover, the best fencer, dancer, swimmer, runner, dresser, the best shot, the best horseman, the best draughtsman of his age. Such was the Count, then a youth of 19, who thus entered Lady Blessington's life, in which he was to play such an intimate part until its tragic close. From France, the regal progress continued to Italy, everywhere greeted with wonder at its magnificence and admiration of my lady's beauty. 2 spring months in 1823 were passed at Genoa, where Lord Byron loved to sit at the Countess's feet and pay homage to her with eye and tongue. From Genoa the procession fared majestically to Rome, of which her ladyship, in spite of the sensation she produced and the adulation she received, soon wearied. She sighed for Naples, where she was regally lodged in the Palazzo Belvedere, a palace, as she declared, fit for any queen. And how the squire's daughter revelled in her new pleasure house, with its courtyard and splashing fountain, its arcade and its colonnade, supporting a terrace covered with flowers, its marvellous gardens, filled with the rarest trees, shrubs, and plants, and long gallery, filled with pictures, statues, and bassi relievi. On top of the gallery, she says, is a terrace, at the extreme end of which is a pavilion, with open arcades and paved with marble. This pavilion commands a most charming prospect of the bay, the foreground filled up by gardens and vineyards. The odor of the flowers in the grounds around the pavilion, and the Spanish jasmine and tuberoses that cover the walls, render it one of the most delicious retreats in the world. The walls of all the rooms are literally covered with pictures. The architraves of the doors of the principal rooms are oriental alabaster and the rarest marbles. The tables and consoles are composed of the same costly materials, and the furniture bears the traces of its pristine splendor. Such was the Arabian palace of all delights, of which her gorgeous ladyship now found herself mistress. And yet nothing would please her indulgent lord but the spending of a few thousands in adding to its splendors by new and costly furnishings. Here she spent 2½ years of ideal happiness, sailing by moonlight on the lovely bay, with d'Orsay for companion, visiting all the sights, from Pompeii to the galleries and museums, with a retinue of experts, such as Herschel and Gell in her train, and entertaining with a queenly magnificence Italian nobles and all the great ones of Europe who passed through Naples. From Naples, Lady Blessington took her train to Florence, where she cast her spell over Walter Savage Landor, who spent every possible hour in her fascinating company, and where she was joined by her husband's daughter, the Lady Harriet Gardiner, a girl of 15, who within a few weeks of reaching Italy became the wife of my lady's handsome protégé, d'Orsay. And it was not until 1828, 6 years after leaving London, that the stately procession turned its face homewards, halting for a few months of farewell magnificence in Paris, where Lady Blessington was installed in Marshal Ney's mansion, in an environment even more gorgeous than the Palazzo Belvedere of Naples could boast, thanks to the prodigality of her infatuated lord. The description which her ladyship gives of her Paris palace reads, indeed, like a passage from the Arabian Nights. The bed, she says, which is silvered instead of gilt, rests on the backs of 2 large silver swans, so exquisitely sculptured that every feather is in alto relievo, and looks nearly as fleecy as those of a living bird. The recess in which it is placed is lined with white fluted silk, bordered with blue embossed lace, and from the columns that support the frieze of the recess, pale blue silk curtains lined with white are hung. A silvered sofa has been made to fit the side of the room opposite the fireplace. Pale blue carpets, silver lamps, ornaments silver to correspond. Her bath was of white marble. Her salle de bain was draped with white muslin trimmed with lace, and its ceiling was beautiful, with a painted Flora scattering flowers and holding an elaborate lamp in the form of a lotus. And all the rest of the equipment of this dream palace was in keeping with these splendors, from the carpets and curtains of crimson to the gilt consoles, marble-top chiffonières and fauteuils, richly carved and gilt and covered with satin to correspond with the curtains. This, although Lady Blessington little dreamt it, was to be the last lavish evidence of her lord's devotion to his beautiful wife, for before they had been many months back in England, the Earl died suddenly in the prime of his days. Large as his fortune had been, the last few years of extravagance had made such inroads in it that all that was left of his £30,000 a year was an annual income of £600, which went to his illegitimate son. Fortunately, the Countess's jointure of £2,000 a year was secure, and on this income Lady Blessington was able to face the future with a heart as light as it could be after such a bereavement. For, eccentric as her husband had been, and in some ways almost contemptible, she had loved him dearly for the great and touching love with which he had always surrounded her. It was during her early years of widowhood that her ladyship turned for solace, and also for additional revenue, to support the extravagance which had now become second nature to her pen, in which she quickly found a small mine of welcome gold. Her Books of Beauty and Gems of Beauty were an instantaneous success. They made a strong appeal to the flowery sentiment of the time, and sold in tens of thousands of copies. Her Conversations with Byron, a record of those halcyon days at Genoa, fed the curiosity which then invested the most romantic of poets with a glamour which survives to our day, and her novels and gossipy books of travel were hailed in succession by an eager public of readers. In these years of prolific literary labor, she was able to double her jointure, and to maintain much of the splendor to which she had become so accustomed. Even her literary children were cradled in luxury on a fauteuil of yellow satin, in a library crowded with sumptuous couches and ottomans, enamel tables, and statuary. To her house in Seymour Place her beauty and fame drew the most eminent men in England, from Lawrence and Lyndhurst to Lytton and young Disraeli, gorgeous as his hostess, in gold-flowered waistcoat, gold rings and chains, white stick with black tassel, and his shower of ringlets. But the Seymour Place house proved too cabined and too modest for my lady's exacting social ambition. She demanded a more spacious and magnificent shrine for her beauty, which was still so remarkable that she was considered the loveliest woman at the court of George III, when well advanced in the 40s, and this she found at Gore House in Kensington, a stately mansion in which Wilberforce had made his home, and which, surrounded by beautiful gardens and shut in with a girdle of spreading trees, might have been in the heart of the country, instead of within sight of the tide of fashion which flowed in Hyde Park. Here for 13 years, with the handsome, gay, accomplished D'Orsay, who had separated from his wife, as major domo, she dispensed a princely hospitality. Her dinners and her entertainments were admittedly the finest in London, and invitations to them were as eagerly sought as commands to a court ball. At Gore House, said Brougham, one is sure to meet some of the most interesting people in England, and equally sure not to have a dull moment. Brougham was himself a constant and a welcome guest, and the men he met there ranged from Prince Louis Napoleon, then in exile without a prospect of a crown, and the Duke of Wellington, to Albert Smith and Douglas Jerrold. So wide was the net of Lady Blessington's hospitality, and all paid the same glowing tribute, not only to their hostess's loveliness, but to the warmth of heart, which was one of her greatest charms. And of all the great ones who sat at her dinner table, or thronged her drawing rooms, not one was wittier or more fascinating than Count d'Orsay, who, in spite of envious and malicious tongues, never occupied to the Countess any other relation than that of a dearly loved and devoted son. Although Lady Blessington's income rarely fell below £4,000 a year, it was quite inadequate to her expenditure, and it was clear to her that this era of splendid hospitality could not last forever. A day of reckoning was sure to come, and it came sooner than she had anticipated. D'Orsay, who seems to have been even more careless of money than his mother-in-law, plunged deeper and deeper in debt, some of it, at least, incurred in helping to keep up the Gore House ménage, until he found himself at last face to face with liabilities far exceeding £100,000, and besieged with duns and bailiffs. Once he was arrested at the suit of a bootmaker, and was rescued from prison by Lady Blessington's rapidly emptying purse. The climax came when a sheriff's officer smuggled himself into Gore House and brought down on d'Orsay's head an avalanche of angry creditors, each resolute to have his pound of flesh. The Countess was powerless to stem the invasion. Her own resources were at an end. The Count himself was penniless. The only safety was in flight, and one day Gore House was found empty. The birds had flown to Paris, and the mansion which had been the scene of so much magnificence was left to the mercy of a horde of clamorous creditors. A few weeks later, all the costly and elegant effects of the Right Honourable the Countess of Blessington, retiring to the Continent, were put up to auction, and 20,000 curious people were pouring through the rooms which her gorgeous ladyship had made so famous, among them Thackeray, who was moved to tears at the spectacle of so much goodness and greatness reduced to ruin. The sale, although many of the effects brought absurdly low prices, realized £12,000, a smaller sum probably than would be paid today for half a dozen of the Countess's pictures. This crushing blow to her fortunes and her pride no doubt broke Lady Blessington's heart, for within a few months of the last fall of the auctioneer's hammer, she died suddenly in Paris, to the unspeakable grief of d'Orsay, who declared to the Countess's physician, Madden, "She was to me a mother, a dear, dear mother, a true loving mother to me." 3 years later, this paragon of all the perfections followed the Countess behind the veil, and rests in a mausoleum of his own designing at Chamboury, with one of the most lovely women who have ever graced beauty with rare gifts of mind and with a warm and tender heart. End of chapter 8.